Hello there, I'm Brian Taylor. A very warm welcome to my latest Herald podcast. Now, as I mentioned last week, if you want to get all of the wonderful Herald content across all the various platforms, the best way is to subscribe, and you can get a special discount through mentioning this podcast. So it's Herald Pod 2021. Herald Pod 2021 is the code to use to get a discount on subscription. I would certainly recommend that very strongly. Now, this week on the podcast, on the program, the pandemic and politics, those plans for COVID passports in nightclubs and at big events, the continuing impact upon the NHS, and to discuss all that and perhaps a look at the gender recognition reform bill as well, I'm delighted to welcome a trio of MSPs, Jim Fairlie from the SNP, Liz Smith from the Conservatives, and Pam Duncan-Glancey from Labour. Welcome to you all. Thanks very much indeed for joining me. The issue of COVID passports, maybe go to Liz Smith first of all. The First Minister had qualms about it, to say the least, but she's now going ahead with it. It's the idea you'd have to show a proof of double vaccination if you're going into a nightclub or to large open events. The Conservatives are giving it a pretty hard time in questions, Liz, to the First Minister, but isn't it happening south of the border under a Conservative government?
I have to say I have grave reservations about the idea of COVID passports as certainly on a permanent basis, or anything that would be seen to be the sort of entry requirement to anything, because I think it raises a whole lot of ethical issues. Mm-hmm. And I think I only saw a little bit of the COVID committee this morning when John Swinney was taking questions from different panellists. Mm-hmm. And I do think that some of this has not been thought through. There's lots of questions that were raised about how it would be organised. And I think, mm-hmm. Anybody who's wanting to know that is left in a bit of a quandary. So I have lots of issues. But the other thing I would say, Brian, is that when it comes, and I speak with a bit of personal experience on this, when it comes to travelling abroad, what I do not have an issue with is that if you were to have proof of a vaccine for travelling abroad. I can remember in 1995, I think it was, when I went to the Himalayas, I had to have a piece of paper for the month that I was away saying I'd had a yellow fever inoculation. I think that's something that can be considered, but I have grave reservations about the rest.
Well, but you say you've got reservations, but John Swinney didn't say permanent. He just said he couldn't, nobody could set a particular timetable upon it. And Downing Street have said in the last couple of days that the Prime Minister intends pretty well exactly this to happen south of the border. So I cannot understand the consistency of the Conservative approach there.
No, well, I don't think there is a problem at all, Brian. I think this is about understanding what is actually being proposed and ensuring, I mean, if you were to introduce it, and as I say, I have very grave concerns, and certainly my mailbag over the last 24 hours.
I can believe it, yeah.
I have to tell you, the vast majority of people have been very against this because they have fears about discrimination. They have fears that some people really wouldn't be able to understand what it was that they were supposed to be doing if they wanted to, attend a nightclub or a big football match and things. And until that detail was provided, then I don't think we would be in a position to make a judgment about it.
Okay, so Pam Duncan-Glancey, what do you make of the proposals as they stand from the First Minister and the Scottish Government?
So I think we need to look really seriously at them. What we've seen is the vaccination programme and the vaccination itself, the development of the vaccination and NHS staff who are delivering it has been an incredible feat for the country over the past year. And vaccination is clearly an incredibly important part of coming out of the pandemic. But what we don't know yet is the science around transmission, how much the vaccination will actually have an impact on transmission, will it really help that? We also don't necessarily know how the government plans to implement this in detail. So I think there's something like 3 million COVID passports would need to be created over the next week. I just don't know how the government's going to do that. And I know that the staff that they might be relying on to do it are absolutely burst at the seams. And actually, in addition to that, if I can just say,
please,
I'm not actually sure that it'll help encourage vaccination either, because what a few academics are saying now is that once you make something compulsory like that, you actually harden the people who were maybe on the fence getting a vaccination. They think, well, I won't. And in actual fact, when you make it compulsory to enter some situations with a vaccine passport, those people tend to pull out. So what you do then have is the effects of, yes, maximum uptake happening faster, but that maximum itself becomes lower. And so that's quite important for us to realise that. I also am seriously concerned about the inequalities in it.
Okay, on the science, Jason Leach said at the committee this morning that it was emerging that vaccination undoubtedly protected people from the worst excesses of the disease, but it also lessened the prospect. He said it did not exclude it, but lessened the prospect of transmission. Although there was it wasn't so good with the Delta variant. But John Swinney also said, basically, Mr. Swinney said that if the sort of case numbers that we have at the moment had happened in January, when the vaccination was not so far advanced, basically they would have had to gone ahead with huge restrictions. And I think we heard Nicola Sturgeon saying, in effect, that either the nightclubs take this system, and John Swinney said this as well, or they face tight constraints and possibly even closure. So it is about trying to push vaccination. Don't you accept, Pam, that's merited, that's worth trying?
Well, vaccination and increasing uptake on the vaccination is really, really important. I think everyone should, when they're offered, take the vaccine because of exactly what you've just said about the benefits of doing it. My concern is that in making it compulsory to get into certain circumstances, and I'm a bit unclear about why those specific circumstances and not others as well. So I think the First Minister and the government will need to think about that. But it's not that getting a vaccine is not important. Of course it is, and telling people or asking people to get it when they're asked is what we should be doing. The problem is the people who were unsure about getting the vaccination aren't encouraged to do so with making it compulsory to get in somewhere. And so we might actually be pushing people further away.
I take your point. Jim Fairlie, Jim Fairlie, first of all, I'll come to you in a second, Liz. Jim Fairlie.
Well, there's a lot of stuff to unpick here, Brian. I was actually on the COVID Recovery Committee myself.
You were indeed, yeah.
And it was, I absolutely concur with both what Liz and Pam are saying, in that my own email bag last night was absolutely chock-a-full of people absolutely furious that this is being imposed. But it hasn't been imposed yet. The Parliament will decide whether or not we actually go ahead with this, and the plans will be brought to the Parliament next week to be debated. What John Swinney also said this morning was that he's met with 150 business leaders already, and he started to outline how they're going to put this in place. And Murdo Fraser raised some very valid points this morning, saying, how is this going to work? Where is it coming from? And the government are working with industry right now in order to be able to put the process in place and make it effective. Because at the end of the day, we've got to try and take the politics out of this particular issue, because it's a global pandemic. Every single one of us is in danger from it, and we've got to get the politics out of it. And
Jim, I didn't hear either Liz or Pam mention politics. I heard them mention pragmatic problems and wanting the detail.
Right. Bear with me. I was about to say, and I commend my fellow committee members this morning for looking for practical answers to what is going to be a big issue. But the point that Liz made earlier on about the permanency of it, it was actually myself that asked the First Minister that question, because everybody has got concerns about their civil liberties being imposed upon and all the rest of it. But the reality is, if we don't get this endemic problem, which it now is, I asked Jason Leach that question this morning, are we now looking at a community, we're suppressing it as much as we can, but we're living with it, so therefore it's endemic. So are we looking at a permanent COVID passport being used? Now, the government can't give an answer to that, because we don't know how long this virus is going to be circulating, or how long it's going to be as dangerous as it is. What he also pointed out is that the Delta variant is incredibly difficult to control.
Resistant
And
to
I was
control,
also sitting in the COVID Recovery Committee last week, and Debbie Schrader was one of the witnesses, and she said, you can now be walking past someone. That's how quickly you can get infected with this disease. So we've got to get it under control. But we don't want to shut down the economy. We don't want to shut down people's natural way of living, civil liberty.
Liz, thanks, Smith. Thanks, Jim. I'll come back to you in a minute. Liz Smith, you were keen to come in.
Yeah, I don't disagree with quite a lot of what Jim's saying there. I mean, I think the issues are, particularly if I read the public mood correctly, I think there are a huge number of people who are very concerned about this coming down. And you're quite right, Jim, it has to be voted on yet, and we're being implored upon not to vote for it because it's seen to be an infringement of human rights, all sorts of different things. But what I'm concerned about, certainly from the discussions that took place that I managed to hear this morning, is that there are inconsistencies in this. For example, I've had somebody come into me just a little while ago saying that, they've had vaccinations in England, that's not being transferred into Scotland, and how do they sort of make the two systems compatible? What would they do?
Didn't the First Minister promise to try and iron out these anomalies? Another one,
she did in an answer
those that had done tests.
My colleague Douglas Lumsden, I think it was, who asked it. I think he's been part of a trial, and because of being part of that trial, and I think there's quite a lot of people who are in part of a trial, he's not been able to get his certificate and the QR code that goes with it. So I think it's the practicalities of it as well. But underlying all this, Brian, I think there are some serious ethical issues. Pam mentioned about some of the equalities issues, and I think that's what we need to deal with if we're going to answer this sensibly and allay an awful lot of the public mood. So that's why at the moment I have grave concerns about a vaccine passport system.
Pam, do you see it going ahead, or do you see it being blocked, or do you see the Greens, for example, demanding assurances? Because of course, at least partly in government, they have two ministers. The Greens demanding assurances, you're demanding assurances. Everyone's looking for assurances. Do you see this going ahead next week, or do you see it being thwarted?
I think it will really depend on whether the government are genuinely serious about addressing some of the concerns that we've raised, and as you put it, Brian, some of the pragmatic concerns that we've raised. I also think that we need to, and nobody wants a politician to come into something like a pandemic or public health and make it about politics, because people find that really difficult. But I also don't think that we can avoid the issue of some of the decisions that need to be taken in order to help us through this are political decisions. So it's about, what are you going to put your money into? What are you going to spend your time on? And I just wonder if we should be really seriously focusing on test and protect as a system, as something that is there and able to identify contacts when they're made and people who have the virus and quickly suppress it and ask people to isolate. And I think if we could get that much in a much stronger position, because we know that they're only reaching about between 43 and 46% of contacts. So if we could get that work functioning properly, then you've got the burden of responsibility there becomes on the systems around us rather than individuals. And I think that's actually quite important. I also think that we need to ask serious questions about whether or not people in different groups and in different areas are going to be affected by the COVID vaccine. We know that a lot of people have been able to access the vaccine, but some people still haven't. And I was really pleased to hear that there will be exemptions, and that's, if this does go ahead, then that's a sensible approach, because we need to have that. But it's important that we don't fall into the trap where we actually then get in a situation where we're deepening further health inequalities that exist as well.
I understand that. I understand that. I hear what you say about test and protect. But if the vaccination is seen to be ultimately the solution, it's not going to completely eliminate the virus that is now being accepted explicitly by John Swinney at the committee this morning, and what I thought was quite a remarkable statement as well. The effort now was to turn it from a pandemic into an endemic approach, as Jason Leach described. But if the vaccination is the approach, and in the 18 to 40 group there is resistance, or there are a substantial number who are not taking the vaccine, isn't it incumbent upon the Scottish Government to do everything they can to push the vaccine while perhaps pursuing the other areas like test and protect as well?
Absolutely, and I will obviously, I hope it's obvious to others to see that I would support the government in all that they do to increase uptake of the vaccine. It's an incredible feat of medical and science in our time. It's probably one of the most important ones of our time. But I don't think you do that by saying to people, you can only get into this situation or be in this place if you get vaccinated. And in fact, what I started earlier on talking about the fact that it actually pushes skeptics further away from being likely to take the vaccination.
I understand that.
So if the aim is to get vaccine uptake increased, then we need to have more mobile vaccination centres. We need to go to where people are and offer them the vaccines.
But Jim Fairlie, you were anxious to come in.
There are three things that I want to pick up here, Brian. What Pam has just said is, I take on board the value of what she's saying in terms of test and protect. But if we're also talking about people who are resistant to getting the vaccine, are they going to get themselves tested? Are they going to choose to get themselves tested? Now, please don't take this as a crass analogy. As a livestock farmer, if you've got a virus in amongst your stock, it's really difficult to pick out the ones that's got it, particularly when they're asymptomatic and they don't show it. So if people aren't prepared to get vaccinated, are they going to be prepared to get tested? If they're not prepared to get tested, they could be asymptomatic and still moving about in the community. And the age group that we're talking about, that 18 to 40, and I raised this point in the committee this morning as well, perhaps we should be better at messaging. We've possibly not gotten enough information out there to encourage young people. Because one of the other things that Jason Leach talked about this morning was the ability of the vaccine to be able to prevent young people getting long COVID. And that to me is a really fundamental thing. Long COVID is the thing that is really going to affect young people if they get infected with this disease. So we've got to get that message to them.
But Jim, I'll bring you in a second. But Jim,
Can I just go back on one of the points that Jim
very briefly, if you would, please.
If someone's sceptical to the vaccine, are they possibly also unlikely to get tested? I'm not sure that I think that's the case. I think most people want to do the right thing. And so people will say, I don't necessarily believe that I want to take the vaccination, but I don't think that they then think I don't want to test myself in case I'm infectious. I think those are two very different arguments. So I'm not sure that I would agree that because they don't want the vaccine, they'll also not get tested.
Jim, can you explain to me the pragmatism of this? You know, it's midnight in Sauchiehall Street or Lothian Road or wherever, and a guy is deciding whether to admit some people into a nightclub. Is he really going to say, "Show me your vaccination papers" or "Show me your online vaccination"? Or if you're standing outside a potentially huge crowd going into one of the football grounds that would fall under the ambit of this, that's going to be a tough call, and is it not a very, very tough ask indeed to start demanding the production of papers before they get admitted?
Well, first thing, my understanding is it won't be papers. It'll be a QR.
No, it'll be online, or a phone.
And Brian, listen, I absolutely get it. This is not easy. It's difficult. It's a really hard position that every one of us are in. And we have to hope that people take that societal view, I'm going to do my bit. So, okay, Pam, I'll take your argument that perhaps people will get tested, but they may not necessarily want the vaccine. But there's three. The point I was going to make is I see three people who are resistant to the vaccine. There are those who are genuinely concerned about what the possible after effects are. There are those who believe there's a conspiracy theory, and I don't say that lightly. A lot of the evidence that we've been listening to in the committee that I'm on is about this misinformation that's going through, particularly through social media. So there are that element. And there are also the young ones, and I made this point in the committee this morning as well. If you're 18, you think you're invincible. If you're 18, nothing's going to touch you. So why bother? It doesn't bother me. It's not my problem. You've got a different perspective at 18 and 19 than you have when you're 51 and 52. And Jason Leach made that point very clearly to me this morning. Indeed. My voice as a 19-year-old isn't going to work. So they've been doing a good marketing campaign to the young people on TikTok and on the social media they're on. So I get that this is hard. I get that it's difficult. But I also think that we do this or it's going to be worse.
But Liz, what about that point? You do this or it's going to be worse. And I remind you again that the UK Conservative government is proposing something comparable.
It's not quite exactly the same, but it's the principle, Brian, about what it is that we are, or the Scottish government or Parliament is proposing.
So what's wrong with the Scottish system that isn't wrong with the UK one? What's wrong?
Because it hasn't been explained in the detail, which I think Jim's committee was at, and he raised a very interesting point just when he spoke in his last answer, is that if this is not all going to be about paper but about online, there are many people in our in our constituencies who are not online, who don't have their app on a phone. What are they going to be asked to do? They might not be the people who are attending nightclubs or whatever, but I think this is where some of the inequalities could come in, and that can be very difficult.
Okay, good discussion, folks. I'm going to move us on to a topic that arises again from this hideous plague, this dreadful pandemic, and that's the question of health waiting lists, the impact upon the NHS while it's trying to cope with the pandemic. It's the numbers who are waiting for other forms of treatment are rising. Pam Duncan-Glancey, that's something that Labour pursued at questions to the First Minister, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, 600,000 people are on waiting lists, and that that in the middle of a pandemic is dreadful. But 450,000 of them were on waiting lists before the pandemic, and I think what we're seeing now is a real crisis in the NHS. Staff are burning out, and patients are not getting the treatment that they need at the timescale they need it. I know someone who's 23 years old. She's waiting for a hip replacement. She's being told that it could be something like 2 years. There was someone suggested a few weeks ago to me that it could take anything up to 5 years plus an additional 120% capacity in the system to get back to orthopedic operations in the way that we were before. And I know we've heard a lot during the pandemic about not putting pressure and overwhelming the NHS, and that's of course really important. Before I was elected, I worked in the NHS, and I saw the hard work that all the staff who worked there were doing day in, day out. They are shattered, but the NHS was crumbling before it. We were in a situation where waiting lists were, as I said, 450,000 people were on waiting lists. We still had a situation where nurses felt they weren't getting a good pay deal, and the numbers of people waiting for cancer support was just increasing, and targets were being missed. So we really need to look at our NHS, and the point at which we tip the NHS into overcapacity changes on the basis of how much capacity it has in the first place, and that's what I think we should be now asking questions of the government. Okay,
Jim Fairlie.
Yeah, listen, the NHS is under immense strain, and we're well aware of that. And I'd say we all do it, and it sometimes may come across as a platitude. It's certainly not. The NHS staff have to be absolutely thanked from the bottom of their hearts. The waiting list that Pam Duncan-Glancey is talking about there prior to the COVID pandemic, what we also have to remember is, and this is what First Minister said in First Minister's questions today.
Parliament, yeah.
We've set a much higher bar for what the waiting list target should be, but there's a changing demographic in Scotland across the entire world, because we're living longer, which is a great thing. With age comes problems, as I'm physically.
That's not new, Jim. That's not new. We've been talking about an age.
But we're living a lot longer. We're living a lot longer, and we're developing far more chronic diseases as we get older. We have an aging population. We are living far longer and expected to work far longer as well. But we're still in the middle of a global pandemic. The waiting list. I've got things I need to go and see the hospital about myself. My dad's in exactly the same position. It's hard. It's a difficult time, and the Scottish Government are doing everything that they possibly can. They're putting in maximum amount of investment that has ever been put into the NHS. We've given the biggest pay rise the NHS has ever had since devolution. We are working incredibly hard to try and ease the burden so that we don't have people who are already under enormous strain getting put under more strain. The investment in the elective surgeries that are being rolled out across the country will be huge in terms of what they're going to do to help in the NHS. But there's absolutely no denying that there are huge challenges ahead of us, and it's been exacerbated enormously by the fact that we're still not out of this pandemic.
Okay, just say to the audience, if you want to put in questions or points on this, we'll be discussing gender recognition in a wee while as well, looking for your points on that. But meanwhile, I'll bring in Liz Smith. Liz, what do you make about this? I mean, the point made by Labour was that the Nicola Sturgeon herself described waiting lists of 83,000 in 2003 as being humiliation for the then government, Labour, Liberal, Democrat. The figure, of course, now being rather higher than that.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with what Pam said about the waiting list scenario was there before COVID, and it is disgraceful. No shortage of concern over that. It has been exacerbated. There are people who are now very anxious about attending an appointment in a hospital, or some people put it off because they just don't want to go. What I'm really concerned about, Brian, is the mental health issue as well.
Okay.
And these are not just people who are going to refer themselves on mental health. I think there's a huge number of younger people who have suffered hugely because of the pandemic, particularly on educational issues and just the aspiration of what they want to do once they leave school and go to college and into the world of work, university, whatever it might be. There's an awful lot of people there who feel very anxious about their future and not quite knowing what to do. And I think that's the worry that I have about the younger generation having to face up to the future. And that's where I think a lot of the resources have to go. But I just finish on one point.
Yes,
during the first wave, I was struck enormously by the fact that in our hospitals, when the emergency situation in our wards was left to nurses and doctors, i.e. the clinicians, they coped remarkably quickly with very serious number of cases. And the decision-making was left to them rather than to many people around the sort of administration of the health service. And I think that's a lesson about what we want to get out of our health service in the years ahead, is that the people who make the best decisions are the ones who are actually closest to what happens on the ground. And I think that's a lesson for us all.
So would you sack the managers in that case?
Well, I've always thought for quite a long time that I think there are too many managers in the NHS, and I certainly don't think I'm alone in thinking that. Absolutely, there's a need for some, but the best people in our health services are the doctors and nurses on the ground, and they want to get on with their jobs in the way, because they're the ones that have the professional training to do that. And I was very struck, and I based my comments on places like PRI, about the Victoria Hospital in Kirkcaldy, where I felt that the decision making at a critical time when ambulances were queuing up with very seriously ill patients. That was impressive that they managed to cope with that.
Pam, how do we get a way out of this? Because some would say that you can spend endless resources upon the NHS and basically it expands to the demand available.
I think you need to work with patients and you need to work with the people who are working in the service. I don't think it is enough just to give people, for example, a £500 thank you payment. I also don't actually think, and I take Jim's point about the investment and the additional pay increase, but actually you're still seeing a situation where nurses and doctors and other staff across the NHS are working their fingernails to the bone. They're absolutely shattered. And the NHS recovery plan to help bring us out of this and bring them out of it has been described by them as woeful and completely inadequate and unrealistic.
But Nicola Sturgeon says in response to that recovery plan is substantial, was worked on for months. She also says there's a pay rise being offered to nursing staff in Scotland that is above anything being offered elsewhere. And she also says that the Scottish Government are preparing to implement a national care plan that might hopefully relieve some of the burden upon the NHS by addressing the care question.
Yeah, and that will remain to be seen. And the First Minister always talks about how good her plans and strategies are, but actually putting them into action is where it all falls down. And that's why this government are consistently missing targets, including in the NHS. The relationship between the NHS and the National Care Service is really, really important, actually. So you've got a really good point there. And in actual fact, I think we need to look seriously at the way that we value people who work in the care sector in the same way that people who work in the NHS. So, for example, that's why we have been campaigning for, and the GMB and other trade unions are really focusing on the £15 an hour for carers. And we heard this week in Parliament that we're not sure if that's actually going to be something that the government and the Greens are going to stick to. That's really important. The other thing about the National Care Service that's going to be one to watch, I'd say, is around how it treats unpaid carers. During the pandemic, we heard this morning, I had my first Social Security Committee meeting where I was able to ask the Minister questions, and I can't tell you how long I've waited for that opportunity, Brian. And I took the most of it, as I did my best there. But one of the things that we heard this morning is that carers, unpaid carers, have been working absolute round the clock. 77% of them said they've not had a break in the last year. And the NHS recovery plan doesn't actually address the needs that they have. And I think if we don't get the National Care Service right, then we're just going to be relying more and more on unpaid carers who are going to be more and more run into the ground. And the final point on the National Care Service, and then I'll stop,
briefly, if you would,
is that we also need to make sure that it is free at the point of delivery, because it is pushing people into poverty. and thousands of disabled and older people who use care services are ending up in debt and are having to pay thousands of pounds to get out of it. And that's despite the fact that the Scottish Government say that personal care is free at the point of delivery for everyone. And so we're still seeing people with bills of thousands of pounds and more.
Thanks for that, Pam. Jim Fairlie, final word before we move on to gender recognition. Do you see those figures, those waiting list figures, which you would accept are dreadful, and the First Minister accepts are unacceptable? Do you see those being brought down at any point soon? Presumably it's dependent upon the progress on the pandemic.
Well, you've literally just hit the nail on the head, Brian. Again, I come back to my experience as a livestock farmer. This disease isn't going to tell us what it's going to do next. It's not going to give us a roadmap of where it's going to go. We've no idea how this thing's going to react. We don't know what the next variant is going to be. We simply don't know, because the virus will decide how it's going to behave. But I would like to come back to a point that Liz made, that the people on the ground working made fantastic decisions. The one thing I would say that might come out positive of the pandemic is that it allows us to have a complete review of everything that we've been doing, because there are stuff that is happening. I mentioned this in the chamber during the week. The way local groups and communities pool together and work together to make things happen without some of the levels of bureaucracy that they would have to go through in order to get things done has been fantastic. Groups that Liz will be well aware of, Lethem for All, Northmuirton Net, the Tulloch Net, those community groups worked together, pulled together and did things. And that social cohesion, that social coming together has been a positive, and it's something that we should really try and tap into. And whether it's in volunteer groups like that, or across the NHS, or across any other part of our lives, we should be looking at it and thinking, how can we do this better? Now's the time to actually think, how can we do things differently now that we've seen a different way of doing things?
Thanks, all three. Thanks very much for that, joining that discussion. I'm going to move finally on to gender recognition. I was in Parliament today. I was broadcasting with my former employer, the BBC, a programme I used to present for many years of questions to the First Minister. I was on as a guest, which was a joyous thing to do. But as I went in, very large demonstration outside, banners up being held up saying "Women won't wheesht" and all that sort of thing, and very active speeches, and another demonstration off to the side, a kind of counter demonstration, those supporting from the reading of it, trans rights. Now, this, of course, is all about the gender recognition, draft gender recognition reform bill. We learned today that although work has been paused on that because of the pandemic, it's now resumed, and the Scottish Government published an analysis of responses. I guess it found the public divided. It said there was a slight majority of groups in favour of going ahead, but around 4 in 10 organisations were against it. 1 in 10 either didn't take a view or the view was not clear. So, and the one that I noted was that they said that it found that the most respondents held strong views in favour or against plans for legal gender recognition reform. Well, those strong views were very, very much to the fore in those demonstrations outside. Liz Smith, remind us what this is all about. What is the bill involving, and why is there such concern from sections of the populace?
Well, can I first of all begin by saying that I think everybody should be whoever they want to be. I think that's a critical human right, and that's fundamental to the way that we live in modern society. Having said that, there are huge issues, and they are very sensitive, and they are very controversial, and they're also very complex. I sat in the debate just before the last session of Parliament ended, where it was one of Parliament's better debates, I have to say, but it was certainly feisty and pretty fiery at times, and it threw up the fact that there are very strong opinions on both sides, and the safety of women was one of the key issues, and that's, as I understand it, why quite a large number of women were demonstrating outside Parliament today, and that's important. And I was interested in what you said there just now, Brian, about the bill coming back on the the discussion.
Well, it said that work is now resuming, which I thought was quite.
Work is now resuming. But again, I go back to my mailbag, which I think is the critical thing by which I judge public opinion. I think there is no question that the views on either side are extremely strong, maybe a bit too strong at times, where it's led into very difficult conversations and abuse and things, and that is completely unacceptable. Indeed. And I think tolerance has to be at the heart of this. But in my own mailbag, I think it's maybe about a sort of, if I had to guess, probably about a 60-40 divide, not in favour of the proposed changes. But there's a very strong number that clearly are. And I think, as parliamentarian, I always think this Parliament, I've been in this Parliament for 15 years now, I always think this Parliament is at its best when it deals with some of the most controversial and difficult issues, whether that's to do with assisted suicide and abortion, all sorts of things. And the debate that we had, I think it was in June, was actually one of the better ones. But my goodness, this is a morass of very difficult and complex debate to be had. And I think we have to be very tolerant and understanding and empathetic about how we go forward in the future.
Pam, what's the concern of women's groups and what's the concern of those representing a trans perspective?
So I'm really pleased that the government have said that they're going to bring this soon, because one of the reasons I think that we do have such polarised views on this is because of the length of time it has taken for the government to consult and then bring the bill.
Interesting.
And that has allowed a vacuum in which the debate has become pretty toxic, if I'm honest, on both sides. And I think that this is a matter of human rights. It's very much a matter of women's rights, and that includes trans women's rights. Trans people need reform of the GRA, and they need reform of the GRA very, very quickly. They need it.
That's to enable what? To enable self-identification? Would you believe that is the route to go?
So at the minute, the process is so over-medicalised and invasive that it is stressful, it causes people harm, and it is breaching their human rights. And that's been recognised by various international health bodies, including the Council of Europe. And they've said that there's nothing in particular, there's no medical test that can tell whether or not someone needs gender identity change. So actually, you really just need to be talking to people and individuals. This is fundamentally about people's human rights, and we need to reform the Act soon.
Do you think the reform is necessary? I hear you saying that you back women's rights, but are you saying that the arguments against this bill have been misexpressed or perhaps misunderstood?
I think people are frightened. It's natural when you come from an oppressed group. As a woman, as a disabled woman, and for trans people, trans women, it's always worrying when you think that your rights are going to be pitted against someone else and that you might lose your rights to something. But actually, that's not what this is about. This is about opening up human rights to a group of people who are fundamentally being really badly let down right now by the legislation that currently exists. It isn't a risk to women's rights, and it isn't a risk to other people's rights. But I can understand, as someone who's faced a lot of oppression and discrimination in my time, I can see why people are frightened, but I think we need to take an objective and very serious look at what the Act is suggesting and what it's not suggesting. So it's not suggesting anything around the Equality Act in terms of taking rights away from people already. This is about giving people more rights and allowing people the space to be who they are and taking away the ridiculous bureaucracy and over-medicalised process in which they need to use to get it.
Jim Fairlie, what do you make of this argument? Where do you stand?
I've got to be honest, Brian, that this is one of those subjects that I have very occasionally dipped into to try and find out a little bit more about it. And the sheer taste of the toxicity of the entire debate has made me go, oh, hold on a wee second.
Back off.
However, as a parliamentarian, I will now have to properly look at this.
You will indeed. You'll have to vote on this bill when it comes to a vote, if it comes to a vote.
To absolutely do that. As a father of two daughters and a husband of a woman, I want to make sure that those rights are absolutely protected. And I'm told on the one side that female rights, women's rights have been taken away. I'm told on the other side that it's transphobic to say that these rights have been taken away. And right now, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't understand a lot of it. I've tried to look into it. I've tried to get some of the terminology, but it is unbelievably abusive. It's unbelievably toxic. And what I need as a white, middle-aged, middle-class man is for somebody to sit me down and say, okay, these are the facts. This is what we're trying to do, and this is the end result that we're trying to achieve. And Liz has been in the Parliament for 15 years. I've been in it for 5 minutes. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing this level of debate where we can actually have these discussions. But I remember watching a programme, in fact, you might have been chairing it, Brian, but it was a young lad saying, I can't talk about racism. I don't have the issues of coloured people. I can't talk about sexism because I am a male and I don't know what it's like to live a female life's female experience. So I can't put the way I would normally try to approach things is, how would I feel about that? I find it really difficult to put myself in this argument. So I'm going to have to try and get the facts, take some of the heat out of the debate and look at it with an open mind and come to a clear decision once the government bring back the proposal and exactly what the proposal says.
Thanks for that, Liz. Can you help Jim Fairlie in this puzzlement and disquiet that he has on this topic?
I'm not sure I can in many ways, because I think this is going to be a very personal issue for many people, and I think that's the strong impression I've got from anybody who's written into me on this, and there's a lot of them. I've had a lot of submissions and emails from people, and I fully understand where many groups are coming from on this, and that's why I'm saying that I think we have to ensure that this debate is on the right level of tolerance and understanding and empathy, and recognising that the duty that we're going to have, and it is a duty to vote on this, we have to be well informed as individuals as to what the right decision will be. And you're not a parliamentarian, or shouldn't be a parliamentarian, unless you're prepared to do that. To
come down on one side or t'other, because you're going to have to. Do you understand the fear that Pam is expressing there? Do you understand also that? I mean, that the argument I hear from privately from some supporters of change is that in 10 years' time this change will have been made, and folk will wonder what all the fuss was about. In other words, they will say that this was a wrong that needed to be righted. The argument I hear from the other side is that those who advocate trans rights are not understanding the concerns and anxieties that there are among women's organisations.
Yeah, I think that there are. What I find interesting about this debate is that on a theoretical level, it's quite easy actually to agree with many of the groups that are involved in this whole debate. When it comes to in practice, and if you give people more rights, do you actually end up taking away some rights? And that's where I think, for me, as I stand just now, I'm interested, and I do have concerns about. So
to be clear, Liz, right now, you would be opposed to the bill. You'd be opposed to the changes.
I'm nervous. I'll be quite honest. I'm nervous about this bill. Very nervous about this bill. But as always, I have a parliamentary duty to listen to all the evidence, which is what I will do. But I am nervous about it just now.
Pam?
I fully support it. I think the Gender Recognition Act is out of date. It medicalises people's lifestyle. It medicalises it. It's invasive, and it means that people are not able to easily be the people who they want to be. I understand, as I said earlier, Brian, I do understand that people are frightened that giving up some people's rights is taking away theirs, but actually that's not what this is about. This is about.
When I had the demo, and some of them were expressing, it was almost as if space was being taken away. Space was their space, their private space as a woman was being invaded to some extent. I stress that's the argument I heard made at the demonstration by some speakers.
And actually what that is, I think, is a misrepresentation or misunderstanding of what the Gender Reform Act is looking to do. So the legislation around spaces and single-sex spaces sits within the Equality Act, not the Gender Recognition Act. So the Gender Recognition Act and reform to the Gender Recognition Act is about getting a gender recognition certificate and making that process much, much easier for the thousands of people who really need to get that. And so I think if people maybe stop and think very carefully about the proposal in front of them, it's not about single-sex spaces. And there's debates around that to be had, incidentally. but that's not what's in this act that's coming before the Parliament.
Interesting. Liz, would that? I'll bring Jim in a second for a final word. Liz, would does that sway you a little bit, or I'm still
nervous.
hear your boots?
I respect Pam's views, and that they're very similar to many other constituents who've been in touch. But I am listening to other concerns, and as I say, it's about whether any changes would have detrimental effects on other people's freedoms and rights, and that's where I think we have to be cautious.
Jim, where do you?
Anywhere, and sorry.
Yeah, well, please, Pam. Yes, carry on, please.
And I really, one of the things I'm enjoying about this conversation is that we're actually having a really good discussion around it, where everyone is taking quite a kind of compassionate approach, actually, and we're listening to one another. And I hope that the tenor of the debate going forward is like this.
It goes in the same nature. Yeah.
I genuinely do not think that there is anything in this particular act that takes rights away from anyone else. Okay. But what will happen if we don't take action on the Gender Recognition Act, people who have a human right to be who they want to be aren't able to do it, and aren't able to get that get the support that they need to do it. Just now, only 1 in 10 trans people go to get a gender recognition certificate because it's so invasive, because it has such a horrible impact on their mental health, and because it's so difficult to get. So this is about giving other people human rights, not taking any away.
Pam, Liz, and Jim, a final word from you. You're going to have to come down on a side. Are you veering towards one particular side or other, or do you still want to hear a bit more info?
Well, the demonstration outside was called Women Won't Queished, and neither they should. Yeah. And on the other side, you've got people whose human rights are being suppressed, according to what Pam's telling me. And I will look very, very carefully at this and make a decision when the time comes. But it is an incredibly difficult subject to be talking about. But that's our job, and we'll have to do it just very shortly.
Jim, Liz, Pam, thank you very much indeed for joining me and what I thought was an absolutely excellent discussion of that and the topics that we discussed earlier. And Pam, you hit the nail on the head with regard to this program, is to try and get that sort of maybe wider range discussion that isn't possible in shorter form. Thanks all very, very much indeed, and thanks to all of you for tuning in and for listening. Remember that offer of a 20% discount with the Herald, and please join me for further podcasts. Watch out for my column. Watch out for all the wonderful Herald output from me, Brian Taylor. Toodaloo the new.